Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be talking about two very important situations. We are, of course, going to take a look at something that we also discussed in our show yesterday with reference to India and the developing Ukrainian crisis. Of course, we discussed the fact that India is in a precarious situation in terms of playing a balancing act between its relations with the EU, the United States and Russia. And of course, what exactly is it going to do in terms of moving forward? The kind of stances it will take, because of course as of now we understand that it has backed off from outrightly condemning Russian moves, which of course have been welcomed by Russia as well. It has also abstained from voting against Russia. We also understand that India is under increasing pressure both domestically and internationally as well, especially after the killing of an Indian student, and thousands of Indian students are still awaiting evacuation in Ukraine, which is of course another aspect that is putting pressure. But the larger concern still remains how it's going to play a more balancing act with regards to its relationship with the EU and the US in terms of the developing crisis. We'll explore that in further detail in our show today. Our second segment is going to take a look at what is going on within Pakistan with reference to the increase in terrorist attacks. We've seen a spike of such terrorist attacks in the past as well, and just recently the attacks in Sydney and in Peshawar and other areas previously as well have pointed out that this is of course something that needs our immediate attention as well, and something that has been taken care of in terms of different measures that have been put into place by the government. What more can be done with regards to this, specifically with the kind of threats that still emerge from across the border from Afghanistan, and what sort of a role can the Taliban regime actually play in this regard for their soil not to be used against any other territory? What can Pakistan do with reference to that? And then of course also the issue of the cases that have been pending in courts in terms of the terrorist related incidents. How can they be actually sped up even further and closed? This is another area that we'll explore in our show today. For our first segment, let me welcome in the studio, of course, Raja Faisal is with us as usual. And then we've also been joined by Mr. Abdullah Wasti, who's the program manager at Jinnah Institute, and he's also a foreign policy expert. I welcome Mr. Abdullah and Raja Faisal to the show, as we'll be joined by more guests online. I will introduce them further. Mr. Abdullah, when we talk about, of course, what has been going on in terms of the Ukrainian crisis and Russia, this is of course something that is of a huge concern for countries all around the world. And then when we talk about the way that different countries are going to be able to maintain their relationships on different sides, this is something that we want to look at further. Before I question you with regards to that, let me also welcome in the debate Mr. Saeed Muhammad Ali, who's joined us on Skype. He is a foreign affairs expert. He's joined us from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Mr. Ali, for being with us in the debate. Mr. Abdullah, when we talk about India and its relationship with Russia and the United States and EU, we understand that it is facing a difficult situation at the moment, and its dilemma is, of course, how it's going to be able to keep on maintaining the stance that it does right now, moving away from an outright condemnation of Russian moves or an outright vote against Russia. But do you think that this will be something that India can put up for long?
Firstly, thank you for having me on the show. As you just put it, I think India does find itself in a tough spot. But if you look at India's foreign policy history, this is not the first time that it finds itself in a situation where it is managing competing camps. And India's relationship with Russia has always irked Western powers. You have to keep in mind that India has a very strong historical relationship going back to the Cold War with Russia, and it considers Russia to be a very reliable ally. And that is also something that both the EU and other Western countries are wary of. As you can see, there have been some public statements asking India to take more of a definitive stance, but both the State Department and even EU officials, and including members of the Quad, none of them have given any harsh remarks on India's abstaining so far. So I think even going back to what happened in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea, India managed to navigate those tough waters, and I think it's going to attempt to do the same because of its strategic interests at this point in time.
Yes, sir.
And so, Faisal, do you think that this is something that India will be able to hold? Because, as mentioned before, perhaps this is something that India can carry right now. It's not facing that sort of stringent measures coming in from different countries saying that it has to choose a side. And then again, when we talk about international politics, it's perhaps okay for countries not to be able to choose a side as well. Do you think that this situation that with regards to Russia allows India to do that?
Sarah, right now, if we look at the situation for India, as Abdullah has rightly pointed out, and I would obviously second him, situation is very dangerous. Why I say it's very dangerous? Because at one side we have Russia. With them, they had you know, a long-term relation with them since dating back to, as Abdullah has rightly pointed out, Cold War. And if we look at you know, procurements, military procurements of India, they were mainly the biggest you know, exporter was Russia. And of course, they have designed their military doctrines looking at the fact that the arms they are getting, they are majority of the arms they are getting from Russia. So they will be facing a problem. Right now, we know that the supply of the arms is seeing a hindrance from the Russian side to India. And if we look at Indian media, it is highlighting that. If we look at the you know, different statements coming out from the previous generals, they are you know, saying it loud and clear that we will be seeing a problem in terms of you know, defense procurement. But if we look at the Western side, since you know, quite a few years, you know, they have been having good relations with the Western countries as well. And practically looking at today's India, India has sort of you know, turned itself into a front line against China for the Western front, and they are actually part of Quad alliance as well in the Indo-Pacific, and that is you know, something which is being considered as against China and Russia as well in Indo-Pacific. So it's a very tricky situation for them. They don't know where to go right now, and that is why we are seeing that Modi regime is facing a dilemma right now, and it won't end here. And whatever the decisions would come out in coming days from India, they will be, you know, very interesting to look at.
Right. I'd also like welcome in the conversation, Mr. Ali. When we talk about China, of course, this has been a huge factor in terms of determining India's foreign policy actions, and it does not go in India's favor to disappoint or offend its allies in the Western world. But of course, its developing relation with Russia and its huge dependency in terms of defense equipment on Russia also puts in a lot of pressure on India to choose. When we talk about its moves with reference to China, do you think that this will be a cost that India can or is willing to pay in terms of its dependence and reliance on Russia moving forward?
Well, if one looks at the posture of not only India but China and Pakistan, there has been reluctance to outright, you know, go out and condemn the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It is a, you know, I mean, while the earlier guests were speaking, I mean, I was in my head imagining, you know, the necessity to walk that tightrope. And historically, India, yes, I mean, since the non-alignment movement, I mean, Nehru's sort of, you know, looking towards his sort of own socialism and looking towards the Soviets, but at the same time being able to walk that tightrope. You know, when it came to, yes, I mean, the USS Eisenhower, you know, came in support of Pakistan in terms of posturing, but I mean, the US and India also maintained fairly decent ties, and of course they've gone into hyperdrive now that there's realpolitik necessity, you know, to use India to try and contain China. But all of, you know, I mean, through these past decades, and let's see, you know, if India can do that now, but Pakistan was unable to maintain this balance, right? I mean, in the past. And, you know, I wonder what lessons we'll be able to learn, you know, with China, you know, in the current context. As far as China itself, I think it's in a tough spot as well, because if you look at the statements coming from the Chinese Foreign Office, I mean, they have tried to create a parallel between NATO posturings and NATO aggressions, within Europe, to what the Quad is trying to do, and what the US is trying to do with its Indo-Pacific strategy. And, some here in Washington, D.C. feel that China is kind of cautiously waiting on the sidelines to see how the West is, and, some of this might be hyperbole, etc., but how the West is going to respond to Russia, because they want to do the same thing in Taiwan. So, and India is now sort of, I mean, there is some disgruntlement, but, I've also been reading that, vis-a-vis the EU, I mean, if you look at the numbers, for instance, the trade with, yes, I mean, armaments, long history of Russian supplies, and that's been a thorn in the side of the US and Indian relationship. But if you look at the amount of trade, it's $7-8 billion of trade with Russia, and $68 billion of trade with the EU alone. Right. So I think India has, and what the mileage it's been getting out of its relationship with the West, and the way that sort of, the strategic competition and the great game is going to unfold, in the future, I think it is going to be a tough situation for India. I think a tougher situation than it is for Pakistan to try and create a balance, which we have not been doing either.
If you allow me, I just wanted to ask you another question. If we, currently look at obviously the diplomacy of the Americans right now, we have been hearing from American side that, of course, maybe they were trying to pressurize, or they were trying to use it as a pressure tactic over Indians. They were, talking about S-400s, which were bought by the Indians in recent times. They bought 5 of the units from Russians in recent times, and that was $5.5 billion of obviously armed trade. But what we know is that, of course, when they bought S-400s from Russians, they were sanctioned straight away. And now, of course, they are talking about India, that India must be sanctioned. Do you think that if S-400 sanctions are imposed on India, that would be owing to the fact that they just wanted to pressurize India to take their side rather than the Russian side, sir?
Possibly. I mean, the US is trying to, because it is a dangerous situation, and I mean, Russia has put its nuclear, so I mean, that might just be posturing, but of course, I mean, there is this fear of the old enemy, and I mean, within the US, there's been, like, I mean, if you look at gas prices, I mean, every day when the American goes out, and there's then the domestic compulsion with the midterms approaching, that President Biden doesn't want to look like he's being soft on the one hand, but inflation is a more immediate domestic concern for him. And I mean, he doesn't want to, see the Republicans win out on him. But I think he's being, I mean, he has been compelled now to, think of, of placing sanctions, including the oil embargo. So I think that with its allies, it is going to be, the devil's going to lie in the detail, right? And these are the tightropes. These are the very tightropes that India will have to negotiate and consider. And will it be in the process be able to get an even sweeter deal out of the US and the EU? That then depends on the acumen of Indian diplomats, and there is already this signaling, that, I mean, what will it take, for India, to have a more firmer relationship, with the rest of Europe, rather than just Russia, and let's see how what this is going to mean vis-a-vis the Quad. I mean, Japan and South Korea, of course, they've thrown in their lot completely with the US, but but India is still holding back. So, what will it take is going to be tricky. And I mean, for India, I mean, in this multilateral world, I mean, if it can maintain that strategic balance, I mean, that will be useful. And that's why seeing Pakistan's posturing and going and laying a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier while Russia was invading Ukraine was seen, at least outside the country, as perhaps not being necessary and sending a very wrong signal to the international community.
But Muhammad Ali, it was very well planned sort of
right,
trip,
and this is something I want to explore further as well with Abdullah Wasti, with what we're discussing, and of course we've discussed at length the Prime Minister's visit to Russia as well, and the way that it was looked at as and perceived. But again, then we also see that the statements that have come out from Pakistan and then the Prime Minister of Pakistan have always been in partnering of peace, and they've been very clear on their stance as well, and perhaps have said in clearer terms what Russia is doing than what India said. When we saw Munir Akram talking about it, it was perhaps more clearer than Russia is. Help me understand, Mr. Abdullah, the kind of tough spot that Pakistan is in right now. Of course, we've had our very close strategic ties with China for such a long time, and we're developing warmer relations with Russia as well. And the visit, of course, focused on the bilateral and energy cooperation. Despite the way that perhaps it may have been perceived, as Mr. Ali was speaking about, don't you think that the kind of statements that have come from Pakistan put them in a more responsible position and perhaps a less precarious one than India is? Because, of course, our relationship with Russia and particularly China have been there for a long time.
Yeah, I both agree and disagree with you over here. And just if I could rewind a bit back to what the previous speaker was talking about, I'd agree that perhaps the optics of the Russian visit could have been managed well in some aspects, but I don't think that there's a direct comparison when it comes to India and Pakistan. I think India finds itself in an enviable position in some regards, in the sense that it is able to exercise some strategic autonomy. And that is primarily because of the economic leverage and strategic leverage that it has at this stage. Islamabad does not have the same tools at this point in time. So I think, which is why you see very different postures and very different compulsions. But I agree with you. I think in terms of both how Pakistan has dealt with the situation, I think the timing was not something that they could have predicted. And I think they made the best of a very difficult situation. Our Foreign Office made sure that they expressed solidarity with Ukraine right before they were heading out for the trip. And I think Pakistan, of course, also finds itself in a tough spot, because it does not want to be drawn into any of these camp formations that are taking place. So I think, yes, it should be recognized that Pakistan has.
I'll go towards Muhammad Ali once again. Muhammad Ali, another very tricky question for you. In recent times, we have been constantly seeing that Indians, they were trying to shift their sort of reliability and towards the Americans and the French side when it comes to the arms. Of course, we know for the fact that they've been getting Chinooks, they've been getting Apaches from the Americans, and then of course they went for Rafale as well at the same time. Don't you think that they were trying to obviously come out of their sort of going towards Russians all the time? And there is another evidence that, of course, if we're looking at today's warfare, of course, drones are involved, at a big number. And if we look at, last year's Lloyd Austin visit of India, he actually gave 20 Predators, Sea Guardians drones to the Indians at that time. Can we say that, the Indians in coming future, they want to get out of, the ozone, the military ozone created by the Russians in coming future, sir?
These are sort of, so yes, I mean, it's probably hedging its bets, and it's also being enticed right? And and the need for restraint is on all sides. So for example, I mean, I'm just doing a paper right now for USIP, looking at sort of China and the great game in the Indian subcontinent. And the people, my interlocutors that I had spoken to while I was working on this report, is they were cautioning, and we'd seen in the media as well, I mean, at least in Pakistan, this kind of this fear that last year after the skirmish, the Sino-Indian skirmish, is now the contention between the US and China in the Indo-Pacific, is it also going to move to the Asian continental shelf? I mean, aka, the Himalayas, which then brings in, of course, Pakistan, because a part of that territorial dispute, I mean, is Kashmir and Ladakh. So, and how the US had started, had decided that they would share satellite data, and these fifth generation technologies, which then creates this kind of, as it is, there's an arms race going on, on the Indian subcontinent. And this kind of, then this strategic, race where Pakistan is looking at India, and India is looking at China, and China is looking at the US, can have very, I mean, if it's not outright sort of nuclear capability building, but this fifth generation, capacity building, where of course the US does have an edge, but then Pakistan looks towards China. So, then what is this going to do to an already precarious region? So that has implications not only for China and India, but also for Pakistan. And there's at least one is trying to, caution the US that it needs to create a differentiation, when it lends, tries to break away India from its dependence on Russia and tries to bolster its capabilities, that it must not do so in a way that further aggravates, Pakistan's precarious situation militarily.
Right. Right. Mr. Ali, I have two questions for you with regards to what we were discussing earlier, but I also have to say thank you to Mr. Abdullah Wasi for joining us. I believe he has to leave. Thank you very much for being with us and taking the time out, Mr. Abdullah, and being a part of the debate. Mr. Ali, when we talk about the fact that, of course, there are economic considerations as well, and this is something that is important in terms of the kind of decisions that countries make, how much of a role do you think this is going to play in terms of the political aspect that we were earlier discussing, of India to be able to choose a side or not, or go ahead with the kind of balancing act that it has done before? If it all boils down to our economic relations with the countries, which one do you think is going to have more impact, even if it does not side politically? Would its economic relations ensure that it has relationship with both the US and its allies and Russia? And secondly, when we talk about perceptions, I understand that there's one thing what a country intends to do, or what a country is putting up as a responsible country and putting up its stance forward, but then there's another thing as to how it's perceived and taken and portrayed even in the media. So with regards to that, how do you think these any measures can be taken from the Pakistani side in terms of making sure that the stance that it puts forward is looked at in the same way? And then, of course, how do you think the power of media is going to affect this?
Well, I mean, the power of media is important, but I mean, there's also, there is also the need for, I mean, in this era of alternative facts and whatnot, but at the end of the day, I mean, there is a bottom line in terms of, and states behave, with, there's not a lot of morality. I mean, they operate in an amoral space, but still the calculus can be more refined, sure. And, the optics can be considered. Well in advance. So I mean, let me give you an example. For instance, I mean, when the Israeli foreign minister has come out and he's expressing solidarity with Ukraine, I mean, no matter what media spin you put on it, it's very easy to see that hypocrisy. I mean, in terms of how Israel is behaving with the Palestinians, right? And how, how it's, there's been media footage where Ahad Tamimi, the Palestinian girl who's been standing up to the Israeli Defense Force, her picture has been taken and portrayed as a Ukrainian girl, right, who's standing up to the Russians. So, I mean, in this, media portrayals are there, but, at behind sort of media projections, there's also, I mean, there are also sort of realities and geostrategic compulsions to contend with. So it seems that, I mean, in the long game, there will be a shift, in India, and that shift has been gradual. I mean, till the 1990s, early 1990s, India had not really opened up its economy, right? So the first time that, I mean, Pakistan's been taking loans from the IMF and the World Bank since the 1950s, 60s, but India didn't go really to the bank like till the early 90s. And that has had good and bad effects, right? I mean, so on the one hand, cotton exports have grown exponentially in India. But, using BT cotton, which is a GMO, a modified seed, and, then the sort of climate change, the high cost of growing that seed, and farmer suicides in India, right? So, I mean, while India presents like it's a version of Shining India, the economic models that it's now increasingly relying on, which are Western sort of controlled, if you will, and Western influenced, sort of these neoliberal models of economic growth do create inequities, right? And have been unable to contend with inequities. So they can, they can create a lot of wealth, but how that wealth trickles down remains a problem. And I mean, that's not to say that Pakistan doesn't have the same problem. In fact, I mean, Pakistan's had this problem for much longer. So, but nonetheless, given this situation, given the fact that, India is now viewed as this market, this billion-plus market of consumers, given the penetration of Microsoft and sort of, software companies, it seems that, India is now, it's no longer thinking of import substitution. Right, so its integration into the global economy and its position, and the recognition that it gets, in the long game, it's going to be hard for it to, maintain sort of that, that Cold War neutrality. And we don't live in a world where there's a, I mean, this is now a multipolar world with new complexities. I mean, Russia might, I mean, we'll see, because even in Russia, we saw, I mean, yes, glasnost, perestroika, Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, and then shock therapy by the Americans, which created a lot of disgruntlement, on the back of which we saw someone like Putin, a strong man like Putin, come to the fore, right? So now let's see, and now his aggression has culminated in this, in trying to take over Ukraine. Now let's see what happens to Russia itself, which will then in turn determine how India chooses to deal with it.
If I could be allowed, I just wanted to give a comment about Indian media.
Right, thank you so much, Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali, for joining us. Let me just quickly also thank Mr. Ali for being with us on the debate, Faisal, and I'll come to you, and for being a part of the show as well, Mr. Ali, and for giving your insight and views. It was truly inspirational to hear you. Yes, Faisal.
Yes, Sana, what I wanted to highlight is, as I have extensive experience of appearing in India, Indian channels as well. So there wasn't long ago, around I think 2020, 2019, what they have been maintaining is they've been maintaining a posture which was so pro-American posture at that time. But suddenly we have been seeing, like since last week, there was a sudden change in their posture about Americans. And in today's Indian media, what they are highlighting is they are constantly highlighting the facts about the alliance which Americans had with Pakistan, and they have been highlighting that every time Pakistan was obviously, sort of dished by the Americans, and this is what they've been highlighting. So I just wanted to share this fact that today's Indian media is trying to sort of, portraying itself as a balancing act in the middle of this foreign policy chaos.
Right, and this, of course, is something, Faisal, that we discussed at length earlier yesterday as well. And our guest from India said that there is a realignment, and will, of course, it remains to be seen what sort of options there are for India on the table, and what sort of a balancing act will it put forward in the coming weeks and months as the crisis develops further. Let me also welcome in the studio now Brigadier Retired Rashid Waleed, who is the President, APRI. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Rashid. With reference to what we were earlier discussing, I'll also pose a question with regards to that, and then move on to our second segment with the spike in terrorist attacks. When we see the kind of discussion that we're earlier having in terms of the options that India has, we also understand that there is of course issues with economic impact as well. As our guest earlier, Mr. Ali, was talking about how India is trying to progress and move in terms of a direction which is perhaps less reliant on other countries and more and so on. And specifically with regards to defense equipment, this is something India has been trying for a while, even though its reliance still remains. When we see this kind of development coming forward and the kind of pressure and limited options that seem to be available for India, do you think that there are measures being taken by India for that future in which perhaps such a tightrope is not something that is going to be a norm for India to follow in international politics?
So, yeah, thanks, Sana. I think what India is doing, it was part of a well orchestrated strategy since long, and I don't think so there's going to be any radical departure in its policy in near future. And despite all the protestations of peaceniks, despite all the pointers pointing out that there's a need of peace dividend for South Asia, because as we embrace geoeconomics paradigm, there couldn't be any progress without connectivity, and India itself is a big bulwark in that, resolving the unresolved conflicts like Kashmir, like minorities issues, like interference into neighboring countries. And we know that the still active Doval doctrine is quite immanent, and its manifestations are evident in the shape of the spike in the violence and terrorism post-US withdrawal. So the short answer to your question is that I don't see any radical departure from Indian strategy in near future. And
all right. When we talk about what is of course going on within Pakistan as well, and the kind of spike that you've already, yes, you were adding something, Mr. Rashid?
Yes, you asked about few measures also which need to be taken to counter that. I think we need to enhance our internal resilience, our counter-terrorism, kinetic as well as non-kinetic counter-terrorism strategy. So therein lies a lot for us to do, and we need to take a stock of the nature of this new spike, this militancy, both in our KP region and Balochistan region.
Yeah. Sure. Right, and Mr. Asha, I was just coming to that as well, because we have of course seen it, as you mentioned yourself, since the US pullout, that this of course has been a major issue for Pakistan as well. We've seen the spike in terrorist attacks, and this is of course a major concern for Pakistan, and various measures have been taken place with regards to what needs to be done in terms of dealing with this. But of course issues still remain, and there's obviously also the problem of external soil being used against Pakistani territory. We also require support from the Taliban regime with regards to what is going on, but they continue to ensure us that their soil is not going to be used against any other. However, we understand that the threats emerging from Afghanistan are also impacting Pakistan and its terrorist impact. When we see the scenario that's also developing in Afghanistan, what sort of measure and support can we really look for in terms of the Taliban regime's current capability and the will to look at this issue, and the kind of support that they can actually offer us in terms of dealing with extremist or radical groups within Pakistan? What can they really do for us?
I think it's all very clear, and we have been saying this in the past 2-3 months. The visit of our National Security Advisor to Kabul was also an indicator of the same desire, and the Taliban Afghan government promised to effect those changes into its governance mode and to squeeze the sanctuaries. Now, you see, our desire is that soil should not be used, sanctuaries should be denied to TTP, but Taliban, despite their willingness, despite their cooperation, have a capacity deficit, because they are a regime that is still struggling and that is still not in control of the whole ungoverned spaces which straddles Pak Afghan border. Now, in this there are two elements of foreign interference. One is, if the Taliban regime squeezes TTP, there is a danger of ISKP and TTP coalescing together and acting against Taliban. So, Taliban are a little apprehensive. Other than that, they are doing their best, and there is an element of squeeze also on TTP, and when that happens, they have no choice but to come and cross the border into Pakistan. So, this spike maybe is the last hurrah of TTP, unless it is supported and sustained by and continually nourished by external sources. It's not easy for them to sustain this militancy, and I think we need to operate on two strands. One is choking the finances, and second is doing all that is possible on development front to drain the swamp and to wean the population, and there are pockets of sympathy in which they come and seek refuge and launch their attacks on security forces.
Yeah,
those need to be drained, and there is right. And Mr. Rashid, with reference to with
Sana, if I could ask a question.
Yes, please continue.
Sana, I just wanted to ask from Brigadier Janjua, sir, if we look at the ground realities of Afghanistan right now, of course we have Taliban who are trying maybe their best, but don't you think, sir, that they lack in an aspect of intelligence? They need to improve that, because they are there, it's their regime, and we have been seeing since a long time that Kunar province and Nangarhar province are the two provinces from where this ISIS Khorasan, the menace of ISIS Khorasan is hailing from, and it is of course affecting not only Pakistan, but it is affecting Afghanistan as well. And when it comes to intelligence, they lack the intelligence. Would it be a good proactive approach from Pakistan to offer assistance in the intelligence sort of sector as well to the Afghan regime, Taliban regime right now, so that this menace can be countered, sir?
Yes, I think it's a very good idea, and to a certain degree it is already being put into practice as well. There are intelligence sharing mechanisms, there are counter-terrorism collaborative efforts, and those all instruments are operative. But we need to be aware of the capacity deficit of Taliban, and we need to be aware of another at the macro level what is happening at the strategic landscape. Afghanistan, South Asia, it's a habitat which is unfortunately in the crossfire of big power rivalry. So, the global politics is being played out here. And one of the concomitants of that global politics is the continual support to the proxy warfare.
Exactly,
and
sir.
We will keep experiencing this in some measure,
but
I agree with you when you say that there's a greater need for intelligence and counterterrorism cooperation between the two countries.
Sir, if we look at the current strategy which was obviously adopted by the Taliban regime in Kabul, it was house to house search for the Americans' arms. And we know for a fact that in recent attacks, of course Panjgur as well, the arms which were recovered from the miscreants BLA, BLF, ISIS, Khorasan, all of them arms, the ones they are using, they are the American arms. And of course, Taliban regime, they have some sort of idea that how it ended up in the hands of BLA, BLF and all of them. So could we say that things are already shaping up, but if there was a constant sort of collaboration between Pakistan's services, security services and the Taliban, the things could have been better managed owing to the fact that American arms are being used?
I agree entirely with you, and but we need to be cognizant of the fact that ever since Taliban regime has taken power, that has been at the receiving end of international community's censure. They are gasping for their economic survival, and they are not completely in control of the administrative situation as well. So when they are confronted with a clear and present danger of a humanitarian crisis, the other considerations, they go low down the order of hierarchy of needs. So that is why they haven't been able to comb the whole country and to recover those caches. As I said, that there are elements from ISKP, there are elements from TTP who have been ideological kinsmen. So Taliban at this stage, once they were confronted with the existential crisis of survival at humanitarian front, could not concentrate much of their efforts towards this security side. So that is why I think there is a deficit there.
All right, Mr. Rashid, of course, this is one thing when we look at the Taliban regime and their capacities in terms of dealing with these terrorist threats, both, of course, within Afghanistan and then, of course, what Pakistan faces as well. But what about what the measures that Pakistan can actually take for itself as well? This is, of course, something that is important for us to understand in terms of the strategies that we develop and the direction that we follow when we see such spike. What sort of limitations are there for Pakistan? How much of a reliance should we even be putting at the Taliban regime if we understand the limitations to their capacity? And then, of course, what is our own personal strategy in terms of dealing with radical groups in the country? Who are we having a dialogue with? Who are we not having a dialogue with? Should we even have that? Because as Faisal would tell you, we have had this discussion internally plenty of times before with our colleague Farrukh as well, who is currently unwell. May he get well soon. But when we speak about all of these issues, then of course it puts into question what really Pakistan can do for itself, because at the end of the day, it's our interest at stake.
It's a very good question, and the simple answer is that we should increase our internal resilience. We know KP and Balochistan both are our vulnerable areas, and we should carry out a differential diagnosis of both problems and apply differential solutions which are responsive to the needs of each problem. Coming over to KP, we know that in 2009 there were 2,586 attacks. Compared to that, now TTP has claimed something like 207 attacks, which though is 42% plus of 2020, but still it's not that situation which was obtaining in 2009. Our security agencies have a very strong and robust counter-terrorism mechanism. Combined with counter-terrorism apparatus of the country, police, armed forces and other agencies, they must gel together and they must increase their intelligence cooperation, intelligence obtaining effort, and drain the swarm, deny these militants of the sympathy. And on the development front, the civil administration needs to increase its development efforts and its imprint. Take the judicial system, take the administrative system right in those areas where there is a complete vacuum which is so far been filled, because armed forces can go and sanitize an area.
Right. Mr. Rashid, I've been told that we're short on time. So I quickly want to ask you a follow-up question before Faisal actually asks you another one. You talked about differential analysis, which is of course an important aspect, but a very complicated and difficult one as well. How exactly are we going to carry a differential analysis? Who's going to do that? And what is going to be the criteria to carry that out?
Yes, that criteria has to be decided by at the national level, federal level, and we need to understand that problems in KP and problems in Balochistan are different. In Balochistan, it is insurgency which is being sustained by disaffection, ethnic ethno-linguistic grievances, and active help and active collusion of external agencies like RAW. Let's not mince our words on that score. But Balochistan itself is a complicated mosaic. It is also not a monolith, contrary to popular perception. There is a Makran belt, there is a Jhalwan Sarawan hinterland, and there is a Pakhtun belt. In all these three areas, you see different responses, different grievance pattern. What we need to do is first understand the nature of the problem and the nature of the grievances. In order to do that, at operational level, we need to carry out amelioration search index, and we should send our special teams, maybe through those mechanism of NGOs like PPHI. We should map those grievances, and after having mapped and diagnosed, we should carry out those solutions which are responsive to their needs. For example, in Makran belt, the needs are jobs. People are more educated, they need jobs, there is a disaffection, there is no state presence. So all those needs and all those grievances need to be assuaged. In the hinterland, these tribes are being exploited by tribal sardars. Yeah. So those recalcitrant sardars and the tribes, their linkage needs to be severed, and we need to understand the nature. Baloch nature is that they value their dignity. Right from the times of Mir Chakar Rind, they have laid premium on their independence. So we must respect. Baloch way of recording a grievance is that they take to the mountains. So we need not overreact. We need to connect to those people and sever the linkage.
Right. All right. I understand the point that you're trying to make, Mr. Rashid, and I also understand that this, of course, is a gigantic task to be undertaken. But at the end of the day, if we are going to be able to deal with such a huge threat, perhaps this is something that we really need to take up and actually look into and be able to resolve. Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid Barijan, for joining us in the debate, and thank you, Raja Faisal, for, of course, always being a part of the show. We're going to be, of course, looking at all of these scenarios in the coming days as well, and try and explore how the situation unfolds both internationally and nationally as well. But at the end of the day, what really is going to be important and what's going to define the future course of action is how states act and how responsibly they act, both in terms of protecting their citizens and developing a foreign policy that is neutral, objective, strong and responsible. Thank you very much for joining us on the debate. We'll see you tomorrow at 7.